All right, welcome to our special meeting first of January 29th. I would like to get a motion to approve the agenda for this evening.
Adam.
A second.
Tim?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions? Any opposed? Motion carried. I will then take a motion to accept an agreement between the Victor Central School District and an employee executed on January 16th, 2026.
Elizabeth?
A second.
Adam.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carried. I'll then take a motion to adjourn our special meeting of January 29th, 2026.
Elizabeth? Oh, give it to Carol. I'll second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carried. All right. That was a quick meeting. We will now turn it over to Dr. Terranova and Christine for our first budget workshop of the year.
Thanks, Mrs. Kostecki. And before I turn it over to Ms. Griffin, I just want to go over the first couple slides. This is a presentation on, we're going to start, as we always do, with the goals of the budget. I'm going to speak very briefly about the current landscape and budgetary strategy. And then Christine's going to talk about the building budgets, the preliminary New York State aid, and our budget calendar review. As we always show this, which is important, these are our goals. Maintaining a comprehensive education, trying to be as strategic as possible with our spending and maximizing our revenues through maximizing every dollar spent, but also trying to generate as much aid as possible in future years, keeping our reserves stabilized, and of course being as transparent as possible. So let's talk just for a couple minutes about the current financial landscape. So to do that, I have to talk for just maybe a minute max about our history, which many people know, especially sitting at this table. So for years and years, we were a district, and I say years and years, back to the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, all the way up to 2021, that was significantly understaffed. A main reason for that was a significant enrollment increase between the 90s and early 2000s. Now, in the last 10 to 12 years, as you know, we've had stable enrollment, but that hasn't put a dent into our staffing needs, where we were significantly understaffed. Then, thanks to the leadership of the Board of Education and the community, two things happened. In 2020, the community exceeded the tax cap, and between 2021 and 2024, we were finally funded what we would call appropriately through state aid, because they gave us the money eventually in 2024 that we were supposed to get, at least for 1 year. Because of that, we ended up having some significant staff increases between 2021 and 2024, which basically right-sized our staff to a much greater degree, a more effective degree than ever before. That led to some excellent academic and other achievements. It includes significantly increasing our special ed graduation rate over the last 2 to 3 years, significant increases in kids participating and taking advanced placement courses, as well as their performance on those courses or on those exams. Significant increases in grades 3 through 8 assessment results. A much bigger increase in kids being able to take dual credit and college level courses, as well as workplace learning and work study and internships. Significant, actually a complete rehaul of our security infrastructure, as well as cleaning infrastructure. And in addition to that, we were able, thanks to the leadership to the board, we were able to pass a $99 million capital project with a 73% approval rate in October of '24, mainly due to being able to put enough money in our capital reserve. So that's our history. Now, the challenge right now is balancing those recent and necessary staffing increases with a long-term fiscal sustainability of our district. What does that mean? So if we just take this year's budget and roll it over to next year, no increase in staffing, no increase in equipment or supplies, but taking into account some of the major increases in health care costs and utility costs and other costs, we end up with about a expense increase of between 5 and 6%, while looking at conservatively a revenue increase of 3 to 4%. That leaves a gap of somewhere between 1.1 and 3.3 million dollars. That again assumes no increases in positions and frozen spending on equipment and supplies. In addition to that, we needed to appropriate $3.6 million from the 24-25 budget to use as revenue for this year's budget, which also creates a hole of $3.6 million moving forward. So we got the $1.1 to $3.3 million gap, but we also have the gap that we're trying to fill through appropriating fund balance. So what do we need to do? We need to bridge this gap while protecting student programs and existing staff. Here's the great news. We firmly believe, thanks to Christine's leadership, the board's leadership, and the work that we're going to be doing over the next few months, that we can do this without any reductions in student programming for next year, without any layoffs to staff, and maintaining the class size parameters that are listed on this slide. For kindergarten through second grade, that's 18 through 20 students. Grades 3 through 6, 21 to 23 students in a class. 7 through 12, a target is below 25. There are some classes such as single advanced placement courses in the high school and an occasional course of the junior high that's a singleton that might have to be greater than that, but we really like to keep classes in the lower to mid-20s at the highest. That's the short-term goal, and we're going to talk over the next few months, 2 months really, of how we're going to do that through trying to expand our revenues and save on expenses. Long-term, it's about advocacy and what I believe is innovation. Advocacy, this board's done an amazing job, over 10 meetings with legislators and state officials to try to take the state aid situation, which again is uncertain, and give us the appropriate state aid necessary to support our expenses and our appropriate levels of staff. In addition to that, so we're going to have more meetings with them over the next 2 months. In addition to that, the community partner idea that this board really created and came up with and charged us to do has come to fruition. As you all know, we have 5 ideas that we're going to move forward with in subcommittees over the next 3 to 4 months to try to look at outside the box ideas to increase revenue besides taxes and state aid, as well as save on expenses. So we're going to really attempt to move from short-term to long-term fiscal health. I wanted to just give that quick update so everyone has the context of what we're facing and moving through this for this year's budgetary process, and I'll turn it over to Christine to get into the specifics of the building budgets.
So we're going to take a look at the other non-personnel costs. So contractual items, equipment, and supplies across our buildings. As we go through these slides, you're going to see a noticeable trend of belt tightening. The district leadership was given a goal, as you saw in the previous slides, about no increase in supplies, materials, and contractual and equipment codes, given that projected budget gap that we've identified in our initial rollover budget. So the building leadership really took a deep dive into their expenditure lines, looked at historical trends and multi-year averages in their expenditures, and came up with some savings, which I commend them for the work that they did on that. I know it was took some effort on their part. So. At the Early Childhood Center, we project a 2.9% reduction in their expenditures, going from $113,000 down to about $110,000. At the primary school, you see a 7.8% decrease at the primary school level. I think there was some more gaps in some of their historical trends versus what was actually budgeted for their buildings. So they found some opportunities there in their contractual lines in particular, and also in their supplies. So they are going from 110 down to about 102 for a 7.8% decrease. At our intermediate school, there's about a 2%. It's a little lower percentage decrease, but their historical trends to budget were pretty close, and it actually is one of the lowest per pupil spending amongst all of our buildings, so they really didn't have a lot of opportunity for cuts in those lines. So we worked through every single line in that and couldn't find a lot more than what we did.
Just for people at home listening, or if they reference this, can you speak to what equipment, like what would categorize, like what would fall under the equipment category or contractual? Because I think people know the supplies piece, but those two, contractual specifically, like just a bit of an explanation.
So contractual could be something like dues, or if you're going to membership for NISMA or something like that, might show up for that particular building. So NISMA is the New York State Schools Music Association. So those types of things will come into your contractual line at the building level. Things like utilities don't, because those are in the operations budget that we did last month. Okay. So those lines aren't that big, but say, for example, at the high school might be a little bit bigger just because we have graduation, and that's a contractual expense. Okay. So professional services, registrations for maybe a conference, something like that. Okay. If they go to on a field trip, field trips are in that line as well. Okay. Okay?
Thank you.
Unless they book it through BOCES, and that's another presentation. Okay, and equipment would be something like musical instruments at that particular building. Some would be an example of that, or maybe at the high school, maybe something for tech classrooms. That would fall under that category.
So if there's like a new course proposal and they need materials, it would fall under equipment or supplies?
It really depends on what it is. So we'll do that might fall under the Office of Instruction. It really depends on if it's a district-wide type rollout, if it covers multiple buildings. This is really more building specific.
Building specific, thank you.
Yep.
Just
At the junior high, we saw a little more of a savings there. Oh, I'm back. Did I go the wrong way?
just to correct the math, yeah, it's 125 instead of, just so people know that it is a decrease, not an increase. The bottom total is just a typo.
Oh, we'll have to take a look at that. We'll fix that before we put it on. Yep. At the junior high, that went down $10,000. Again, a lot of looking at the trends and saw that there was some opportunities there to decrease. At the senior high school, we had a 3.6% decrease. Here's one where you mentioned the contractual codes. That's a little bit bigger, as you'll see from the other buildings. There's just things that go on at the high school level for contractual stuff. Kids going to more academic, outside, co-curricular type activities that drive those numbers. So overall, with the work done by the leadership team at the buildings, they were able to decrease 4.8% on the building equipment, contractual, and supplies codes overall.
Christine, how were these reductions developed and by who?
The building principals, and from there they drill down into department leaders. So say in the music department, art department, they would reach out to their teachers. So for example, at the high school, Brian went to science and social studies and math and ELA, those instructors, and if there was a specific need. But really, truly, we looked at a lot of the trends, and they were trending lower in historical. So we still have a little bit of a cushion in those lines for opportunities for them if something comes up. There was still some wiggle room left in those lines when they reduced them.
Thanks to Christine's leadership, this was the first time, at least since I've been here, and the principals embraced this, to really look, as she said, at trend data over the last 3 to 5 years on how much they've budgeted for supplies and equipment and how much they've spent and for what things and any trends across those years. And they realized that they could be tighter with some of their budgetary lines for equipment and supplies, but as Christine said, still have enough bubble or room to support any needed supplies in the middle of the year. So they basically took a deeper dive. We've been doing this with staff over the last 3 years, But in terms of equipment and supplies, it's the first time they really focused on a kind of an analysis of previous spending for equipment and supplies, and that helped a lot. But they really, and I talked to all of them, they've owned this and have done a great job with it.
So, some of the supply reductions are large. Is that going to put a burden on teachers? You know, for instance, I know over the years, teachers spend out of their own pockets for, you know, materials for their classrooms. So I'm concerned about that.
So the instructional allocations amongst the teachers within those codes, they did not change those. Each one had a little bit of cushion above and beyond what was allocated to some of those teachers individually, so it's not impacting the teachers individually. We did make some changes in our library codes just based on the reductions in our state aid on our, over the years, that has occurred in our library materials aid, but that doesn't mean that we won't be able to support those things with additional, with a budget transfer like we would have historically done in the past. The great thing about right-sizing the equipment, contractual, and supplies codes is those are the codes that people can put POs on in the software. So if someone sees they have 10,000 in a line, they might spend 10,000 in a line. We want to make sure that they're spending what they need and not just spending to spend down their lines. Does that make sense? So, but the teacher allocations have not been touched. There were actually some areas that we had to increase that weren't reflected from last year. So we did incorporate some increases, and there were other decreases. Some of the things on the supply codes and the contractual were not at the teacher level. They were at the administrative budget codes or the building level budget codes. So they have, like, at the smaller, at the younger grades, the building, most of their building supply budget is in one code. So they might have 50,000 in a line, and then they allocate it to the teachers. Their allocation to the teachers might end up being 30 because they'll allow for increases late. They leave a cushion to allow for increases later on. So it's not directly impacting the allocation that was given to those teachers.
Yeah, Chris.
That's a great question.
I had a similar question, just thinking about, you know, I always hear teachers complain about supplies, not complain, but they need supplies or they're buying it themselves. And were you able to communicate the mission, like, hey, this is coming, but we're doing this because you were more important than, you know, was that able to, because I can just, it comes down to a budget, like, hey, can you tighten up supplies for next year? Like, to a teacher, that's just like, oh my gosh, seriously? You know, I don't know if that was, or did it not hit the teachers, it stayed with the principals?
No, it definitely, the principals definitely communicated with their teachers around this. And Christine communicated that with the leadership staff, and then I communicated, really those first 3 slides have been communicated with our staff already, which includes the fact that we're looking at no increases net total of supplies and equipment and no increases net of staffing, and why. But the good news is preserving programs, not reducing teachers, not cutting teachers, and not changing our class size parameters, which are the 3 big, you know, rocks that we need to stay focused on. So, for example, on Monday, I sent a message to the staff explaining that, and Christine did so with the leadership staff as well. Okay. So, and then actually tomorrow, we're going to send the same message, not as specific, but generally to the community in my community message. So everyone should know the situation we're in and what we're trying to do.
And would there be shifts, like from one building to another? For example, the 6th grade cohort is larger than other elementary cohorts, and they move to the junior high school next year. So that's also taken into account as Brian Gee looks at the junior high budget for some of these items, knowing that he's receiving more students.
So the overall allocation per building is not done on a per pupil basis, on a per pupil count. I did do some reallocation of our library budget based on a per pupil count, but within the library overall, the group as a whole, they can transfer between each one of the lines. We can always do a budget transfer between buildings later on. Okay. So on an overall basis, that, you know, so, and also on our, like I said, our spending per pupil, I actually did look back a couple of years. It's old it's enrollment from 2024, which is what I had access to quickly to kind of take a look at it to see where everyone was trending. And they're all not too far off from each other in the low 100, it ranges from like 123 to 196. At the high school level is 196 because there seems to be more on travel and trips and things like that. But their per pupil allocation is not that different.
Okay, thank you.
Karen, would you like to join us?
Karen squared. Just quickly, to your point, Tim, around the teacher allocations, there also is, too, a much greater emphasis on some of the provisioning around curricular resources to support all of our classrooms. So when we think about K-6 humanities instruction right now, we're provisioning through the Office of Instruction curricular materials, classroom texts, workbooks, intervention resources. That's coming through a centralized location and not up to teachers to provision for the book clubs in their classroom or for those kinds of things. We're trying to do it in a more centralized way. So that's also part of the ways that we're looking at expenditures and supporting the teachers in that way too, so they don't have to be on their own island to get some of those materials, and the things that they are purchasing for their classrooms can really meet the needs of the kids at hand from year to year.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Overall, though, these dollar values, if you look at compared to the overall budget from 25-26 at 711 represents, of course, I don't have the full numbers for 26-27, so I'm looking at the 25-26. But overall, it's about 0.6 of our budget, so it's not a big portion of our budget. So a lot of our cushion really is in our health. We budget a cushion in our health insurance lines and our staffing lines to make sure that we have opportunities to, if someone comes to us with something during the course of the year, so with a request, to be able to accommodate them. So I don't think we've had a situation, unless I'm not aware of, where we haven't been able to accommodate. Looking ahead and kind of looking at the other side of the budget, last week the governor released her budget numbers, and looking at for Victor, our budget increase from this year's state aid output reports, that is what comes out in December, so that first column, it's different than what we put in our budget last year. These are what we actually are anticipated to receive during the 25-26 school year. They're the December state aid output reports numbers that are based on our reporting of final expenditures from the prior year. So if you notice, like your building aid, your BOCES aid, your transportation aid, those are all expense-based aids. So those aren't pinned down in the springtime when the budget numbers come out. They get pinned down in December. So if you notice those lines, for example, BOCES aid went up significantly from what that went up from the prior year, but it also went up from for next year because of what we are projecting to be spending during the 25-26 school year on that line. So we actually, and you're going to see on the next slide, I'll give you some numbers, but we are actually going to be about $611,000 higher than we originally budgeted for 25-26 for our state aid. So that's great news. The 26-27 governor numbers are only going up, though, from what we actually are getting this year, 1.26%. You notice there's some big increases, there's some smaller increases, and we've had a couple of little reductions, but overall we have about $516,000 coming in from an increase in state aid. Again, this is very early in the budget season. There's a lot of opportunities for that to change over the next several months, and we all know April 1st is the due date, but we may or may not have that information at that point in time either.
And as you can see, obviously the foundation aid is the big one. So there's good news and bad news. The good news is this year, the governor gave us, in her initial run, a 1% increase. Last year, she didn't give us any increase. The bad news is we really need a 3 to 4% increase, which is why between now and whenever that budget is finally approved by the legislators, we have to do some significant advocacy to get that number up and really support what we've talked about, which is adjusting the foundation aid to support more special ed, accurate numbers, and other areas that we can focus on.
Christine, you said that the number can change. Is it possible it could decrease between now and April?
That is possible.
Okay.
It is possible. I don't normally see that. Typically, you will see an increase because I think she kind of starts low and the others go high and they meet somewhere in the middle. Again, Dr. Terranova mentioned, it's really good news that she started with a 1% base because last year she said, nope, if you don't, we won't take money away from you, but we're not going to give you any more. So last year it was a 0% increase if you were on Safe Harmless. So this year she's starting at 1%, which is good news, I think. I'm hoping it's good news. So, as I pointed out on the last slide, the 25-26 state aid's coming in $611,000 greater than budgeted. Fantastic news. The building amount for 26-27 is the building aid amount is unlikely to change due to our current capital project because some of that expenses won't get finalized and those debt service payments don't happen until after the 26-27 school year. We're still working through some of the timelines of the financing based on when we figure out filing the final expenditure reports. But as you remember, when you were looking at doing the capital project, your debt service payments minus your building aid equals your local share that had that tax impact that was talked about during that time. Again, I also mentioned about the expense-based aid, so those estimates for BOCES and transportation is really based on the 25-26 projected expenditures in those categories. That's subject to change, obviously, as we get to in the springtime and we finalize those numbers. We report them in the fall. December, they tell us the aid that we're going to get based on that. So looking ahead, our work, we have several things ahead of us. We have several meetings, 2 in February, 2 in March, and again in April when we review the final budget and adopt it. The budget hearing is on May 5th, and our voter registration is on May 12th, and the vote will be on May 19th. At this time, if there's any questions, anybody wants to dive into anything deeper, I welcome any questions.
I have one more.
Sure.
Back to the preliminary state aid, what falls under other state aid?
So under other, that is our excess cost aid. What's driving that down predominantly is our excess cost aid for the high cost students. So basically anything above and beyond a basic local share for those types of students that are high cost, that have a lot of additional services necessary. So based on reported numbers of students like anticipated to be in those programs. Again, these are projections for next year. So it's hard to project who's going to be in those programs at this point in time and what the cost of those programs are. I think what's really driving that down is more that they are anticipating a growth in our local share based on some other driving factors that put us in a hold harmless or safe harmless situation in our foundation aid is the wealth ratios in our community based on the growth in the community and the assessment of the property values. Also, income that gets reported when you file your taxes and you put the school district code. They collect all that data and it factors in to determine wealth in the district. Those things are combined into a ratio that drives the calculations for some of these numbers. So the biggest portion of that reduction is a reduction in our excess cost aid, but other things that go into that aid, our instructional material aid is in that number, some small stuff, but the bulk of that 1.6 is the excess cost aid.
Is there federal aid for things such as special needs students that can help with this?
So the federal money is accounted for in the special aid fund and not accounted for in the general fund budget. So we already max out our 611 and 619 grants at this point in time. Unless there's a growth in those two numbers, there's no way to transition more costs over to those if we're already maxing them out. So there won't be anything additional to cover that, but we do see an increase in our UPK numbers next year, which we're going to be looking at that to see if there's an opportunity for that to help support our general fund budget a little bit as well. I know there's been a little bit of a local share on our UPK, but it's very minimal at this point in time. So that's a project that Karen Finter and I will be taking a look at to see how that works for us. You're welcome.
I just want to say thank you to the to you and the leadership team, the principals, for really doing that deep dive. Like, I like the looking at what is accurate instead of guessing. You know, it's like even at home when I'm budgeting, you know, it's like, well, what did you spend last year for real? And just, but still leaving enough cushion because, you know, I don't want to get back to the days where, oh, we ran out of masking tape in May, so no kids' artworks goes up on the walls. So I like that, you know, you're keeping a little bit of cushion, just keeping in mind, you know, we like to have some of those reserves for next year's budget, so we won't have as many, and just keeping that in the back of the mind. But this is the smaller portion of the budget, so it shouldn't impact. But I appreciate that there was a lot of work in looking at what do we really spend, and
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
They did a great job. It was great conversations. I think it was eye-opening looking at some of the historical trends and seeing that gap, and it made them realize, oh, well, maybe there is an opportunity here. So that was great. We will be sending out a memo to staff. We do a cutoff for our purchase order so that we can do some final costs. Last year, because of when I started, that memo went out a little bit later than normal, and people kind of panicked. We're going to send that out now, so they know that March 31st, please get your POs on, so that we know what you plan to spend for the rest of the fiscal year, so we know what we have left to help with filling the gap in our budget if there remains one.
Yeah.
So.
It is, like, that was an eye-opener for me, that, like, they had to decide by March what they're going to do next year. So it's like
Well, we're actually having these, and I'm actually, my opinion, some of the conversations I had in January were a little later than I would normally do. It was just, we've had a lot of upheaval in our office, but we had a lot of these conversations. We could, you know, we're talking in January now about what these teachers, the allocations might be for the next years. Yeah. It is hard. Yeah. It is hard. You know, people think when they get their spreadsheets in the springtime about what their allocations are for their budget lines and how to allocate that amongst the teachers in their building. They get that in May or June after the budget's open, and we say, okay, we're going to start putting on our Amazon POs, and we're going to put everything in the software now for you to be able to order for the next school year, and they think that's budgeting. Well, budgeting's done by then. Budgeting's done by May. Yeah. So this year we took those same spreadsheets and we started with those. So our purchasing assistant, Susie, has been wonderful at taking those spreadsheets and putting them in a format so that we can actually start from a budgetary perspective on it, so it's decided up front what those allocations are and not being reactive later on saying, here's what your total is, now go ahead and allocate it. We're taking those from what we did last year, using it as a base to build the budget instead.
Yeah.
And that's where we identified some of the cushions too.
Yeah, so that was great. So thank you for doing that.
Welcome.
Deep dive.
Christine, with our total buildings budget, I think it's slide 12, for the 25-26 school year, budgeted was 711. Is it ever typical that there is leftover funds in this account? And if so, what happens to those monies?
So we look at the overall budget. So at the end of the year, if you had $10,000 in a line, you spent $9,000, those funds go into at the bottom of the bucket on that right-hand column of that appropriation status report that everyone sees. That is what we put into our fund balance. Okay. So it's at the end of the year when we look at what do we have left over, how much did you appropriate for next year, that little extra money that we were able to put into a reserve, that's where all of that goes in. So it helps to helps us be able to save for future projects and build our reserves, which, I know we talked about at one of the last meetings about what our reserve situation is as a district, not just our capital reserves and total reserves, but also what are our non-capital reserves and where we are in relation to not just other districts, but what is our comfort level as a district. So we're one of the lower ones around, so for a district our size. So that's something that we definitely need to be addressing for future years to make sure that we're stable.
So if there was like $7,000 left over in contractual for high school, that doesn't necessarily roll over into the contractual for the 26, 27 for high
does
school?
not.
Okay, just for clarity, thank you.
Right, and if they have an outstanding PO at the end of the year, so say, for example, graduation comes along, and we've put on the PO for the graduation ceremony, whatever that might be, say it's $10,000 to rent, whatever we're doing. If we haven't received the bill by the end of that year, we actually can roll that over. So if there's something that is purchased, that an order has been placed, and it's not received by June 30th, we do roll those POs forward, but there are certain criteria that decides whether did we receive the goods and it becomes payable, or did we not receive the goods and it becomes a carryover PO. So that would be the only time that it would become a carryover PO. I'm not a big fan of carryover POs because it muddies the next year's budget.
exactly.
And I think it confuses that report. So say the next year, and it can artificially inflate.
Right.
So if they had 10,000, they spent 7, they've got 3 left, and if they had just kept an open PO and they carried it forward to the next year their budget they'd see 10,000 to start, 3,000 in the adjustment column, and then they think they have 13,000, and that 3,000 maybe does get spent, and they spend 13,000. They think that skews their historical trends.
Right.
So it makes it look like they spent 13,000 in that one year when really they didn't. So that's why we looked at 3-year trends.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
1, thank you. 2, so our reserves are low comparative, and I just would like to point out that they're pretty much non-existent previous years
6% is
ago.
pretty
So I
low.
mean, I know there was a genuine concerted effort by this board and the boards before to actually build the reserves and create the other reserve accounts. When there are funds left over, to Mrs. Mitchell's point of that goes into fund balance, are there any specific line items that are restricted as far as what they can go to specifically
No.
as far as a reserve? So we have kind of, the district has free reign as far as what reserve or bucket to put that in?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Bottom line, if you have $109 million budget, and if our goal is to have 5% left, let me round it down to make it easier math. If we have a $100 million budget and we spend $95 million and we have $5 million left, it's all an overall bucket. The only thing that restricts where it goes for the next year, as if your budget goes up $110 million, there's a 4% set aside that every district has, and you need that. Part of that is a cash flow situation because you don't have funds coming in July and August, and a lot of September because of the tax bills that money comes in usually later in September. You have payroll in September, a big bump in your payroll. So that 4% comes right off the top. But it's the increment, because you've already set aside 4% of the $100 million. Next year, you'll be setting aside 4% of $110 million. So it's of the subsequent year budget, you can set aside 4%.
And I think it's important to note that we did have significant reserves a year ago, but the board and we made the strategic decision to put almost all of it in our capital reserve, which is why 28 million went towards that. Now that 28 million is gone because we spent it, which is actually what we're supposed to do, at least according to the comptroller. So now the tricky piece is trying to replenish those reserves in this tight financial situation.
And then the last question, and I don't know if it's beneficial to us or not, but during the course of the current year, are we doing some sort of gating with the expenditures to kind of help project of when those influxes of spending are going to occur in the following year? So as we're budgeting, and we know that in November,
There's a real heavy emphasis on some contractual stuff. There's supplies kind of wane in, pick your month, to position us as far as where we're going to be in a cash flow standpoint heading into reserves.
So usually when you get that time, at that point in the school year, you've received your levy, which is for us about not quite 60% of our budget. So we're fine as far as a cash flow perspective. And then our state aid starts flowing in December and January. So that it is strategically spaced out that way. So we're okay there. It's not about cash. We actually have money in reserves, in a savings account. We are looking at different investment options for that might lock those funds up, but right now that is somewhat, it's held in a liquid asset. So in a worst case scenario, from a cash flow perspective, we have the cash available to us, although categorically it's defined as, reserve cash, or we have that 4% sitting in our cash accounts as well. So as far as, I hope that answered your question as far as setting aside. We really don't set aside currently to say that, but it's that 4% sitting there. You've got cash coming in for your taxes in the fall, and then it shifts to more of the state aid money coming in.
Yes, it does answer that. I wasn't asking about are we setting aside. I meant from a gating, lack of a better term, standpoint of knowing historical, what's the trend of January? What's the trend of February, where we know, based on what we have as far as liquidity, where is it going to be a little tighter in the calendar year, so that I want to be certain that the district, you specifically, and Dr. Turnova and everybody, feels comfortable that there's not a sitting there like, oh, April, okay, it's going to be lean in April, and we know that. Is there a way that you are consistently comfortable with the liquidity of the district?
So our treasurer does a cash flow statement every month. So she's looking at our cash flow, and we will pull in from the 4% if we need to, but we haven't had to because of the way the cash flow works in the fall. We are looking.
We do that without penalty?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And the other piece of that is, because that 4% is really kind of unrestricted. It's unappropriated fund balance. It's for us to use. The other piece of this, one of the things that we're looking at is a company that a lot of the Monroe County school districts are using, which is called CashVest, which will do an analysis for us. It comes with a cost, but they have a guarantee that you don't get charged unless they feel that they can show that they can at least meet or exceed that a return on your investment. So if they look at it and say, if you invested in this, this, and this at this time, and they will meet with us monthly and talk about, based on our historical cash needs, they'll trend and say, it looks like this next month you're going to need this much money. Because I'll use the example. In July and August, we don't have as big payroll, but in September we do. So we might be able to lock up some funds in July and August, but then we want to make sure we have that available for us. So they'll look at those things for us, which is a great tool, but we'll see if they can meet their fees or beat their fees on the investment and that interest. So, but we do also, on the other side of it, on the expense side, we do projections. So I start about December, taking the current year budget, looking at what I think we're going to spend in the lines based on historical trends, based on what I know, based on conversations with the department leaders of lines. A lot of the bigger ticket ones like health insurance and salaries are kind of set, so those are easier in my office to look at. So we do, on the expense side, watch that too. So we have some guardrails in place.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Just for clarity's sake, slide 5, no reductions to student programming. Is that academic programming only, or does that include like the overall student programming?
You mind putting up, sorry, thank you.
You want to go back?
The slide. So I'm sorry, Elizabeth, what was the question?
Student programming, if you could just expand on like what that means. Is it strictly academic programming, like during the school day, or would it be co-curriculars? Like I know we have boosters.
Our goal is to have no reductions in any programming.
Any programming.
That's related to kids. So yes, that does include extracurriculars, after school, things like that.
Thanks.
Anything else? Thank you, Christine, as always. It's a fun start to the year, isn't it? And as a reminder, since we talked a lot about advocacy tonight, February 7th is the legislative breakfast. I was with the other board presidents, and there was a specific request from Monroe County School Boards to please, if you have not registered, do it at least 5 days in advance.
The deadline is technically tomorrow.
I know. They wanted at least 5 days, technically try to get in tomorrow. Everyone is very excited that Bella and Aiden will be joining us at this year's breakfast. They actually said that they had the most attendees sign up and registered for this than they've seen in the last several years.
That's great.
So let's get ready for advocacy. All right. We are all set then on the budget status, and we'll move into our informal board goals review.